Berlin, March 6, 1944. The city wakes under a pale gray sky. Smoke still lingers from the night before, coiling through streets lined with shattered windows and half-buried trams. For a brief moment, there is quiet, the uneasy pause that Berliners have learned to recognize. Then comes the sound, a faint vibration at first, like distant thunder rolling across the plains. It grows heavier, steadier, until every pane of glass trembles. People stop in the streets and listen. Men in uniform rush to rooftops. Women shield their children and look upward. Above the haze, hundreds of faint silver silhouettes appear. Wings steady, engines droning in perfect rhythm. Each one a massive four-engined bomber, sunlight glinting off their frames. They are not the night raiders of the Royal Air Force. These aircraft have come in daylight. Bold, deliberate, impossible. For years, German engineers had laughed at the idea. They called the American bomber slow, clumsy, a flying target. But that morning over Berlin, the laughter stopped. The story of the B-17 did not begin in the skies over Europe, but in the calm offices of Boeing Field, Seattle, in the early 1930s. America was still in the Great Depression. Funding for the Army Air Corps was meager, public attention elsewhere. Yet inside Boeing's hangars, a small group of engineers believed that the future of war would belong to aircraft that could fly higher, farther, and strike deeper than ever before. Their goal was ambitious: to build a bomber so strong it could defend itself. A flying machine that could cross oceans, carry tons of explosives, and still return home through gunfire and weather. The concept seemed almost arrogant at the time. The Air Corps had asked for a twin-engine bomber. Boeing offered 4. They called the prototype the Model 299. It first flew in July 1935, gleaming in the summer light over Puget Sound. Reporters gasped at its size and speed. One Seattle newspaperman, watching the test flight, remarked that the aircraft looked like a flying fortress. The name would stay forever. But innovation comes with a price. The prototype crashed during evaluation. A forgotten pin left in the control lock. The mistake cost Boeing the contract. The Army chose a cheaper, simpler design from Douglas instead. For a time, it seemed the flying fortress was destined to be a brief footnote in aviation history. Yet the Army Air Corps was quietly intrigued. Even after the loss, a few officers saw something extraordinary: the promise of strategic air power, the belief that wars could be won not just by armies on land, but by bombers in the sky. They approved a small number of production models, designated B-17B, for testing and training. In Europe, meanwhile, clouds of another kind were gathering. Germany had defied the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilding its air force in secret. By 1936, sleek monoplane fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 were taking shape. Across the Atlantic, the idea of a heavy bomber looked increasingly outdated to many strategists. They argued that speed and maneuverability, not armor and guns, would decide the next war. Still, Boeing pressed forward. By 1938, a refined version, the B-17C, took flight. It carried up to 8,000 pounds of bombs and bristled with machine guns. To its critics, it remained overbuilt, too slow to outrun fighters, too heavy for precision work. But to its supporters, it represented something larger: America's belief in distance, endurance, and industrial reach. When war erupted in Europe in 1939, the United States watched cautiously. Germany's blitzkrieg shocked the world. Armies fell in weeks. Cities burned under waves of dive bombers. To many observers, the lesson seemed clear. Massed, fast-attack aircraft were the future. Few noticed the quiet arrival of a dozen B-17s in Britain for evaluation. They were awkward, imposing, and unfamiliar in RAF hangars. British officers called them big and brave, but terribly optimistic. Inside the U.S., the debate over strategy deepened. Should bombers strike by night, hidden from fighters and flak? Or should they fly in daylight, trusting in altitude, accuracy, and defensive firepower? The Royal Air Force, bleeding from daylight losses, chose the night. The Americans, proud of their engineering, chose the day. By 1941, the B-17E had emerged, a machine that looked more fortress than plane. It had a longer range, a rotating tailgun, and armored protection for its 10-man crew. Every new feature was designed around one idea: to survive. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States no longer had the luxury of theory. America entered the war with barely a few dozen B-17s ready for combat. They were immediately deployed across oceans, from the Philippines to Hawaii to the British Isles. And in those first months of battle, the myth of invincibility began to crack. By the summer of 1942, the war in Europe had become a furnace. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies from the French coast to the Volga. Britain fought nightly to survive. And across the Atlantic, the United States began to send its first bomber groups to England, the embryo of what would soon become the 8th Air Force. They arrived cautiously, in stages, long convoys of men and machines crossing the ocean. The crews were young, some barely 20, trained hastily in navigation and formation flying. The first squadrons were stationed in the English countryside, in Suffolk, Norfolk, and Cambridgeshire, airfields carved out of farmland. To local villagers, the Americans seemed full of confidence and chewing gum. To the British veterans beside them, they seemed dangerously optimistic. The doctrine they carried was unlike anything Europe had seen. The U.S. Army Air Forces believed that daylight precision bombing could cripple Germany's war machine, if they could reach it. Factories, oil refineries, rail yards, and submarine pens would be hit in daylight, allowing bombers to aim with accuracy impossible by night. The idea promised logic and efficiency, but few realized what it would cost. In August 1942, 12 B-17s launched the first American raid from Britain. The target, railroad yards at Rouen, France. It was small, symbolic, and mostly successful. Crews returned triumphant, but the Luftwaffe had barely responded. When the raids moved deeper, resistance grew fierce. By late 1942, the 8th Air Force expanded rapidly. Hundreds of B-17s and their crews arrived. Bases like Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, and Kimbolton filled with noise, engines, marching boots, and the constant rhythm of training. Commanders like Ira Eaker and Carl Spaatz argued that America must prove daylight bombing worked, even as their British allies doubted it. The results came swiftly and brutally. As missions pressed into Germany, to Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg, the sky turned into a killing ground. B-17s were strong but not immortal. Luftwaffe fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, tore into the formations with cannon and rockets. Crews fought desperately from gun turrets, firing streams of tracer rounds. Engines burned, wings sheared away, parachutes blossomed across the sky. In October 1943, during the second Schweinfurt raid, 60 of 291 bombers failed to return. 600 men were lost in a single day. It was a mathematical disaster and a moral one. Even the bravest commanders began to question whether daylight bombing could be sustained, but in Washington and London, the logic of production ruled. America could build faster than Germany could destroy. Each month, new B-17s rolled out of Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed plants. New crews arrived to replace the fallen. The flow never stopped. Technology evolved too. The B-17F introduced stronger engines and better gun turrets. Yet what truly changed the campaign was not the bomber itself, but its escort. When the long-range P-51 Mustang appeared in late 1943, everything shifted. The bomber's stream could finally be protected all the way to the target and back. The Luftwaffe, once unchallenged over its homeland, began to bleed. Still, one name remained sacred: Berlin, the capital of the Reich, seat of power, symbol of Hitler's regime. It lay deep inside Germany, beyond the range of most fighters until now. To strike it in daylight was to challenge the Luftwaffe in its own sky, and prove that the fortress and its doctrine could endure. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force had grown to nearly 2,000 heavy bombers. Their commanders planned a direct assault on Berlin's war industry: ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, and rail hubs. Many called it madness. Even among the Americans, whispers spread through the barracks. No one comes back from Berlin. But in March, orders were issued. The weather forecast promised a narrow window. The crews gathered in the early dawn, listening to briefings as red lines stretched across maps toward the heart of Germany. The target was circled once, Berlin, and the room fell silent. What followed would redefine the limits of courage and machine alike. Every weapon has two halves: the machine and the people who believe in it. The B-17 was no exception. To the men who flew it, it was more than a bomber. It was a companion, sometimes a coffin, sometimes a miracle. The crews who climbed aboard these vast aircraft each morning understood the odds. Statistically, a B-17 crewman in 1943 had less than a 1 in 5 chance of completing a full 25-mission tour. Most knew, deep down, that survival depended on luck, not statistics. Yet, they kept flying. A B-17 crew was 10 men strong. Each had a job that could decide the life of all others. The pilot and co-pilot wrestled the heavy controls through flak and frost. The navigator charted courses across featureless gray skies, guided by stars and instinct. The bombardier peered through the Norden bomb sight, a marvel of American engineering that promised precision within a few hundred feet. Behind them, gunners crouched at their posts, waist, ball turret, tail, their world reduced to glass, steel, and the flicker of tracer rounds. It was a small world at war within a larger one. At 25,000 feet, temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Frost formed on oxygen masks. Guns froze. The roar of engines was constant, deafening. Men who returned from missions spoke in low voices, describing skies filled with black bursts of flak, like flying through exploding rain. What held them together was the bomber itself. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name not from propaganda, but from design. Its airframe was exceptionally strong, a web of aluminum spars and reinforced bulkheads that could absorb extraordinary punishment. Photographs circulated of fortresses returning with massive holes in their wings, tails half destroyed, fuselages shredded, yet still landing on English soil. These images became legend, proof that endurance could be engineered. Technologically, the B-17 was a paradox. By fighter standards, it was slow, cruising around 150 miles per hour slower than the Luftwaffe's interceptors. But what it lacked in speed, it compensated with stability and defensive firepower. 13 heavy machine guns covered every approach: nose, tail, sides, and belly. Each gunner knew his arcs, and together they formed a moving fortress in the sky. A formation that multiplied strength through unity. Crews learned to trust the geometry of survival. If each bomber held its position precisely, the crossfire of hundreds of guns could protect the group. But even a small drift could open gaps. Discipline became sacred. Chaos meant death. Young pilots practiced for weeks to maintain formation under turbulence, fear, and exhaustion. Yet no armor or doctrine could eliminate fear. The first time a gunner saw enemy fighters break through, or a bomber ahead vanish in a sudden flash, courage became something quieter, a kind of endurance. Letters home rarely mentioned fear. They spoke of weather, routine, and boredom. Only in diaries found later did the truth appear: the trembling hands, the silent prayers before engines started. The technology also carried its own myth. The Norden bomb sight, protected under lock and guard, was said to be so precise it could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel. In reality, under combat conditions, wind, smoke, evasive maneuvers, accuracy was far less perfect. But the belief mattered. It gave men a sense of purpose, that each mission, however costly, had meaning. By late 1943, the Flying Fortress had become a symbol of American determination. Posters called it the gun platform that carries democracy to the enemy. To the ground crews, who worked 12-hour shifts in mud and rain, the bombers were their sons. Engines polished, bullet holes patched, names painted lovingly on the nose. Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, Yankee Doodle. Some of those names survived the war. Most did not. Still, something enduring was taking shape. The B-17 was proving that endurance itself could be a weapon. Each mission that returned, each wreck that limped back on 3 engines, told a story that the fortress might be slow, but it would not break. And above the English countryside, as rows of silver bombers lifted into the pale morning sky, there was a growing realization. The Americans were not testing a plane anymore. They were testing an idea. To the men of the Luftwaffe, the arrival of the B-17 posed both a problem and a puzzle. At first, German engineers dismissed it. The fortress seemed too large, too slow, and too proud. But as the war dragged into 1943, that arrogance began to fade. The sheer persistence of the bomber stream and the damage it inflicted demanded respect. Captured wrecks were examined carefully. At Rechlin Air Base, engineers studied twisted fragments of aluminum skin and gun mounts. They measured bullet paths, armor thickness, oxygen systems. One officer wrote, "These machines are built like battleships, not airplanes." The Luftwaffe recognized that traditional interception tactics, quick slashing attacks from the rear, were failing. The fortress formations turned the sky into a lethal grid of crossing fire. New tactics emerged. German pilots began frontal attacks, diving head-on into the bomber streams, firing cannon shells at cockpit and nose before breaking away at terrifying speeds. They equipped their Bf-110s and Fw-190s with heavier guns, some with 30mm cannons, others with rockets designed to tear through formations from a distance. Each side adapted. Each believed the other was fighting the wrong war. To American planners, daylight precision bombing was the future. To the British, it was madness. The Royal Air Force had learned the cost in 1939 and 1940, when daylight raids over Germany had been slaughtered. They turned instead to night bombing, area attacks that targeted cities, not factories. Darkness provided protection, though not precision. The Americans saw this as morally uncertain and strategically inefficient. They wanted the enemy's industry, not its civilians. It was a clash not of allies, but of philosophies. Inside the halls of command, arguments echoed between Sir Arthur Harris of the RAF and General Ira Eaker of the USAF. Harris believed in overwhelming destruction, the complete breaking of Germany's cities. Eaker believed in daylight accuracy, in breaking the enemy's war machine piece by piece. Both were convinced they were right. Both would lose thousands of men proving it. For the Germans on the ground, the contrast was clear. The night brought terror, sudden firestorms and confusion. The day brought precision, a slow, dreadful procession of silver bombers, visible for miles, their intent unmistakable. Civilians learned to distinguish the difference. The long, unbroken drone of American engines meant daylight death. As 1943 turned to 1944, the daylight raids grew larger, more organized, and more daring. Entire formations stretched across the horizon. Hundreds of B-17s flying in tight, layered boxes, escorted by twin-engine P-38 P-38 Lightnings, and the newer, sleek P-47 Thunderbolts. But none could yet reach Berlin. The distances were too great. The fighters had to turn back halfway, leaving the bombers alone for the deadliest part of the mission. German fighter controllers knew this window well. They called it the bomber's blind hour. They waited until the escorts vanished, then unleashed waves of interceptors. The pattern repeated again and again. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Münster, each raid exacting a terrible price. Yet the B-17s kept coming. Every day, new groups replaced those lost. Every day, German radar screens filled again with the same slow, steady formations. The Luftwaffe could destroy planes. It could not destroy the system that built them. By early 1944, the air war was shifting. The Allies had begun to understand that control of the air was not simply tactical. It was existential. Without air superiority, the coming invasion of Europe could not succeed. Thus, daylight bombing was no longer just about destroying factories. It was about drawing the Luftwaffe into battle and bleeding it dry. When the long-range P-51 Mustang arrived, armed and able to escort the bombers to Berlin and back, the equation changed forever. The Luftwaffe's safe zone vanished. German aces found themselves hunted in their own skies by faster, more agile American fighters. Losses mounted, fuel dwindled, and replacement pilots lacked experience. The Reich's once proud air defense began to bend under the strain. But even then, the symbol of defiance remained the same. Berlin. To strike it in daylight was to prove mastery, to show the German people that no corner of the Reich was beyond reach. Within the halls of high command, some argued that it was too risky, too symbolic, too soon. Yet, to men like Jimmy Doolittle, newly commanding the 8th Air Force, the risk was the point. If the flying fortress could reach Berlin and return, it would mark the turning of the war. The target was chosen. Factories in the capital producing aircraft engines and bearings, vital arteries of the Luftwaffe's heart. Weather was the only variable. When the forecast cleared for early March, the operation was approved. Crews across England were briefed. The maps showed a red line running straight into the core of Germany. No diversions, no shortcuts. The silence in those briefing rooms said everything. They all knew what awaited them. The test that would define the fortress, the doctrine, and perhaps the war itself. Dawn, March 6, 1944. The English countryside lay still beneath a pale mist. Frost clung to the wings of hundreds of bombers lined along endless runways. Inside each one, crews performed final checks by flashlight, adjusting oxygen lines, testing gun mounts, inspecting the Norden bomb site that hung like a sacred instrument of fate. At Thorpe Abbotts, the crew of the 100th Bomb Group's B-17 Royal Flush listened as their operations officer pointed to the map. A red line cut straight across Holland and into Germany's core. The target was circled once, Berlin. A long silence followed, broken only by the scratch of a pencil marking fuel calculations. Everyone understood. Berlin was no ordinary target. It was the heart of the enemy. Engines roared to life, one after another, until the morning fog trembled under the sound of 1,000 pistons. Ground crews stood back, faces pale in the exhaust. For many, it was a ritual of farewell. By 8:30 a.m., the first formations lifted off. Their contrails formed ghostly ribbons across the dawn sky as they climbed toward 25,000 feet. The mission plan was vast. More than 660 B-17s and B-24s were dispatched from multiple airfields across England, supported by nearly 800 escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and a handful of the new long-range P-51 Mustangs. Their target, aircraft engine plants and railway yards in the German capital. It was the first daylight raid ever attempted on Berlin. Crossing the North Sea, the bomber's stream stretched over 100 miles long. Radios crackled with clipped American voices, coordinates, altitudes, adjustments. Pilots tightened formations, knowing that every inch mattered. Somewhere beneath the clouds, ships steamed east toward the same continent that awaited invasion. Over the Netherlands, the Luftwaffe's radar screens began to pulse. Operators at stations in Groningen and Bremen watched in disbelief as the dots multiplied. Großer Verband, viele viermotorige. Large formation, many four-engine bombers. Within minutes, the alarm reached Berlin. At Adlershof, Luftwaffe Command scrambled every available unit. Fighters from Jagdgeschwader 11, JG-26, and JG-54 climbed into the cold March air. More than 500 interceptors, Messerschmitts, and Focke-Wulfs were thrown into the path of the approaching bombers. Many pilots had already flown multiple sorties that week. Fuel was scarce, ammunition limited, but the order was clear: defend the capital at all costs. As the B-17s crossed into western Germany, the first contrails of enemy fighters appeared. Gun turrets swung into position. The calm chatter of intercoms filled with tension. From the nose of one fortress, Bombardier Lieutenant Charles Murphy later wrote in his log, "They came at us like arrows." The sky ahead turned black with flashes. The first attack wave hit the lead formation head-on. Bf-109s fired 20mm cannons directly into the noses of the bombers, then dove away at full throttle. Several fortresses exploded instantly, their debris scattering across the cloud layer, but the formation held. Every surviving gunner fired back, tracer streams converging into an invisible wall of fire. A Luftwaffe pilot, Hans Kornatz, described it afterward. "It was like flying into a steel storm. You could not find a gap between the bullets. The fight spread in all directions. Bombers lost engines and fell burning through the formation. Parachutes bloomed like white petals over Germany, yet others tightened their intervals, closing ranks to fill the gaps. At 22,000 feet, one B-17, the Liberty Run, took a direct hit to the tail but continued flying. Its rear gunner dead, the control cables barely holding. The pilot refused to break formation. Inside the cockpits, the world narrowed to gauges, smoke, and prayer. The intercoms buzzed with terse fragments. "Flak ahead. Fighters high at 12 o'clock. Stay tight." For 6 straight hours, the bomber stream pushed east under constant attack. By midday, as they neared the German capital, black columns of smoke began to rise ahead. The city's anti-aircraft guns, the flak towers of Berlin, opened fire. Shells burst in timed sequences, each explosion marked by a dark puff at altitude. The air became a grid of invisible death. Navigator Lieutenant Robert White later recalled, "It was like flying through a thunderstorm made of metal." The bombardiers steadied their aim. Below them, the city spread wide, factories, rail yards, and rivers glinting through the haze. The lead groups opened their bomb bay doors. There was no turning back now. The order came: bombs away. Tons of explosives fell through the clouds, drifting toward the city that had once mocked the flying fortress. In that moment, even amid chaos and loss, one truth was clear. The impossible had been done. Berlin was being bombed in daylight. The bombs fell in long, trembling waves. From 25,000 feet, the city below seemed almost unreal, gray, distant, motionless. Then, as each formation released its load, the illusion shattered. Factories along the Spree River, rail depots, and engine assembly plants vanished under rolling curtains of smoke. Columns of flame rose through the haze. Inside the lead aircraft, bombardiers noted impacts, adjusted settings, and closed the bomb bay doors. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling slightly. No one cheered. For the men in the air, there was no sense of triumph, only endurance. They knew that every second spent over the target was another second under fire. As the last groups completed their runs, Berlin's anti-aircraft batteries intensified. The sky boiled with black bursts of flak. Each one sounded like a heavy door slamming against the hull. In one formation, Captain William Lawley's B-17 took a direct hit to the nose. His co-pilot was killed instantly, and he himself was wounded, blood filling his eyes. Yet he stayed at the controls, guiding his crippled plane away from the city, refusing to bail out while any of his crew still lived. He would later receive the Medal of Honor, one man's endurance mirroring the plane he flew. Back in Berlin, on the ground, air raid wardens directed civilians toward shelters beneath the Tiergarten and the U-Bahn tunnels. Those who looked up saw the impossible. Hundreds of American bombers shining in daylight, moving as one vast mechanical tide. For the first time, the people of Berlin understood that their skies no longer belonged to them. German officers at command posts watched in disbelief. At Flakturm Humboldt-Hain, Colonel Hans von Willesen recorded in his log, "Enemy bombers over the city at noon. Impossible, yet true. Their formation holds even under our full fire." He paused before adding, "If they can do this, they can do anything." The Luftwaffe continued to fight, but exhaustion was setting in. Fuel reserves were thinning. Pilots were rotated faster than they could recover. Veterans like Adolf Galland and Günther Röhl reported that replacements, many barely out of training, were being thrown into the air with minimal experience. Each engagement bled away another fraction of Germany's once proud Air Force. Meanwhile, for the Americans, survival was a matter of precision and unity. When one bomber was hit, others moved to cover its blind spots. Crews shared oxygen masks when lines froze, patched bullet holes with flight jackets, and prayed their engines would hold until the North Sea. Inside the ball turret, a cramped glass sphere beneath the fuselage, gunners like Sergeant Paul Sears fought isolation and frostbite, spinning endlessly to track enemy fighters streaking past at 400 miles per hour. When he was finally pulled from his turret after landing, his hands were locked around the gun handles, frozen in place. By the time the formations turned west, the sky behind them was filled with smoke and debris. Radio transmissions crackled with loss reports. Some groups had lost a third of their aircraft. Others were scattered, limping home in ones and twos. Still, the mission had succeeded. The heart of Hitler's capital had been struck, and the message was unmistakable. No city, not even Berlin, was beyond the reach of the flying fortress. As the first damaged bombers crossed the English Channel that evening, ground crews stood ready with flares to guide them in. One fortress came in with half its tail missing, another with 2 engines dead and its landing gear jammed. Crews watched silently as it skidded across the runway, sparks trailing behind it, before coming to rest. When the smoke cleared, they counted the bullet holes. More than 700 in one aircraft, and yet it had made it home. The numbers told the price. 69 bombers lost, over 700 men missing or dead. But in strategic terms, the cost was not in vain. The Luftwaffe had committed nearly all its available defense wings to that single day and still failed to stop the attack. That night, while mechanics patched the surviving aircraft, the news reached both sides of the channel. In Germany, propaganda broadcasts admitted minor damage, but could not hide the shock. In England, headlines read simply, "Fortresses over Berlin, in daylight." In the following days, Allied intelligence confirmed what commanders already sensed. The German fighter force was reeling. For the first time, the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility had cracked. Inside briefing rooms, weary crews stared at maps covered with red lines and cigarette ash. The air was heavy with exhaustion and quiet pride. No one spoke of victory, only of the next mission, because everyone knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of the end. And as Berlin still burned under its own smoke, another reality dawned across Europe. The sky now belonged to the bombers. The morning after the raid, Berlin awoke beneath a haze that dimmed the rising sun. The smell of smoke and burnt metal hung over the city. Streets were littered with glass, twisted girders, and the shredded remains of machine shops that once produced engines for the Luftwaffe. Rail lines around the Anhalter Bahnhof were torn apart, workshops in Tempelhof cratered, and thousands of civilians wandered the ruins in disbelief. It was not the destruction itself that shocked the German capital. Berlin had endured countless night raids from the RAF. But the timing? Daylight had once been their refuge. Now, even the day belonged to their enemy. German newspapers published vague reports of minor American attacks. Yet in private, the mood at the Air Ministry was somber. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, inspecting the damage, wrote in his notes, "If the Americans can come by day, we can no longer protect our own heart." For the first time, officers spoke openly of the impossible strain. Every daylight raid forced hundreds of fighters into the air, draining the last reserves of fuel and pilots that Germany could not replace. At Luftwaffe Reich headquarters, the analysis was grim. The Berlin defense network, long considered impenetrable, had failed. The anti-aircraft batteries had fired over 20,000 shells that day, achieving little more than smoke. Radar coordination had collapsed under the scale of the attack, and the fighters were overwhelmed by numbers and range. In the weeks that followed, more raids came. Each one pressed deeper. Each one bled the Luftwaffe further. By late March, intelligence estimates suggested that Germany had lost nearly 30% of its operational fighters in less than a month. The Luftwaffe's own commanders admitted they were running out of both planes and pilots. For the Americans, the success was both strategic and psychological. In the cold offices of the 8th Air Force at High Wycombe, mission reports poured in. Losses were staggering, but the breakthrough was undeniable. Berlin could be reached in daylight. The idea, once mocked as impossible, had become reality. At airfields across England, surviving crews were greeted as heroes. The bombers that returned, riddled with holes and patches, were examined by engineers with reverence. Mechanics ran their hands over shattered aluminum, noting how the fortress had absorbed punishment no other aircraft could. Each damaged plane was a lesson. Every repair a new refinement for the next sortie. For the men who flew that day, victory felt hollow. Of the 660 bombers dispatched, nearly 70 had not returned. Many others limped back with empty gun positions and missing friends. The empty bunks in the barracks told the cost more clearly than any report. Yet, amid exhaustion, there was pride. The quiet pride of having done what everyone said could not be done. In Washington, newspapers hailed the mission as proof of American endurance and technology. Headlines read, "Fortresses hit Berlin. Daylight assault successful." Photographs of battered bombers filled the pages, their crews smiling faintly beside them. Behind the optimism, commanders knew the truth. Daylight bombing had not ended the war, but it had turned it. From this point forward, Germany's air defense would never recover fully. Each new raid drew out what remained of the Luftwaffe, forcing it to fight and die in the skies above its own homeland. For every bomber lost, Germany lost a dozen irreplaceable pilots, and each mission brought the Allied front one step closer to the invasion that was already being planned across the Channel. Berlin's daylight ordeal had done more than scar a city. It had shifted the balance of the entire air war. In the weeks following the March raid, Allied commanders studied every frame of reconnaissance film. Berlin's rail junctions were paralyzed, its aircraft engine plants heavily damaged, and repair work stretched already thin German resources. But the most important result could not be photographed: the collapse of German confidence. Before March the 6th, the Luftwaffe had fought with belief. Its pilots knew they were defending home territory, flying from familiar fields, backed by radar and command. After March 6th, that certainty began to erode. If the enemy could fly straight into Berlin in daylight and return, then nothing was safe. The Americans had paid a high price, but in return, they had broken an illusion. From that day forward, every German fighter pilot who took off to intercept knew he was fighting an air force that could not be stopped, only delayed. The fortress, mocked as slow and heavy, had proven a truth older than any theory. Endurance can outlast speed. The change was not immediate, but it was relentless. April brought new raids, this time escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustangs that flew shoulder to shoulder with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Losses fell sharply, while Luftwaffe attrition soared. The once feared German aces, men like Johannes Steinhoff and Walter Dahl, watched their units crumble around them. The Reich was running out of everything: fuel, training time, and faith. In June 1944, just 3 months after that first daylight raid, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The air supremacy that made it possible was born in those brutal months of daylight bombing. By keeping the Luftwaffe fighting over Germany, the 8th Air Force ensured that the skies over France were almost empty on D-Day. The same fortresses that had bombed Berlin now flew close support over the beaches, guiding the new phase of the war. On the other side, Germany struggled to adapt. Armament Minister Albert Speer begged Hitler for more resources to rebuild the shattered aircraft industry. Factories were moved underground, dispersed into forests and caves. But it was too late. The Allied bombers were striking faster than reconstruction could keep up. Even the synthetic fuel plants, the lifeblood of the German war machine, came under relentless attack. By autumn, many Luftwaffe squadrons could barely fuel their planes for training flights. For the American crews, the war went on with grim rhythm. New men replaced the lost. New bombers filled the empty dispersal fields. Those who had survived Berlin carried scars, frozen hands, fractured nerves, and memories they rarely spoke of. Some returned home after 25 missions. Others volunteered for more, unable to leave their comrades behind. They called themselves the Lucky Ones, though none truly believed it. Back in Germany, the people of Berlin learned to live with the sound of engines overhead. What had once been awe became weary acceptance. Every new raid confirmed what the March daylight attack had foretold: that the skies were no longer theirs. The fortress-like flak towers still stood, but they fired now in desperation, more to prove defiance than to defend. By the start of 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Its last reserves of fuel and pilots were spent trying to resist the inevitable. When Soviet armies closed in from the east and American bombers returned from the west, Berlin, once the center of power, was already a city under siege from the sky. The B-17's story had come full circle. The plane, once dismissed as obsolete, had become the symbol of Allied endurance, its silhouette etched forever into the clouds above Europe. It had not been the fastest, nor the most advanced, but it had been the one that never gave up. And that endurance had changed the course of the war. History often remembers victory as a matter of speed, firepower, or brilliance. But the story of the B-17 Flying Fortress reminds us that endurance can be just as decisive. It was never the fastest aircraft, nor the most elegant. It was heavy, loud, and often wounded, yet it kept flying. In a war defined by destruction, the fortress represented persistence. Every crew that climbed aboard knew the risks. They knew that each mission was a coin toss between life and death. And yet they went, not out of arrogance, but belief. Belief that daylight, precision, and courage could shape the outcome of a brutal century. For the Germans who once mocked its design, the B-17 became an omen. Each formation over Berlin was a reminder that the war had turned, that technology and will fused together could reach anywhere. For the Allies, it proved that freedom could be carried not only by armies, but by endurance itself, the determination to hold formation, to keep flying through the storm. When the war ended, thousands of flying fortresses were scrapped. Their aluminum melted down into peacetime machines. But their spirit endured. In every aircraft that carried the idea of range, resilience, and purpose. In the decades that followed, aviation would grow sleeker, faster, more complex. Yet none would carry the same quiet weight of those cold, gray mornings over Europe. The B-17's legacy is not measured in bombs dropped or targets destroyed, but in the idea it proved. That courage, when disciplined by endurance, can change history. In daylight, the fortress challenged the darkness and won.